Hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing well this Tuesday. We're going to let a couple people get in, let everybody get settled here. Thank you so much for joining us for our Classics Revisited webinar. We are so happy to be continuing this great conversation and providing a work break with more titles of our worlds. We will listen to the professor as we go through, and Professor Michael Sugrue's reflections on Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. As people are coming in, we're going to give everybody a few moments to log in and get settled. While we do that, please go ahead and set your chat panel to make sure you're sharing with all attendees and panelists. The default tends to be all panelists, but if you ask a question or have a comment, we'd love everybody to be able to see it. So please set that to all panelists and attendees. Also, let us know where you're joining from today. We'd love to hear from you. It looks like we have some from Canada, Nebraska, Florida. I love seeing England. Thank you for joining us so much. We appreciate it. Published in 1719, Robinson Crusoe is considered by some to be the first English novel. A surprising adventure novel. This book may mean so much more when read as an adult, which is something that the professor will go into depth on. We are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion about Robinson Crusoe, and would love to hear from everybody and all the questions that you have. Feel free to put those into the Q&A panel, the pop-out panel there throughout the lecture, and we will definitely address all questions that we can get to later on in the program. Today, I once again have that great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Michael Sugrue to our ongoing webinar series, Classics Revisited. Dr. Sugrue is a professor, is a graduate of the Great Books program. He earned his BA in history from the University of Chicago and his MA, Masters of Philosophy, and PhD in history from Columbia University. Professor Sugrue has taught at prestigious universities such as Princeton, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and many more. My name is Christy Goebel. I'm the Global Marketing Specialist here at Bibliotheca, and behind the scenes we have my colleague Marie Thoreault helping to make sure everything runs smoothly. We will be sharing the chat log with all attendees in our thank you email for attending. So make sure you do switch your settings to that all attendees and panelists, because that's how people can go ahead and read your comments and questions for sure. If you have specific questions that you want answered during our question and answer period, please use the Q&A panel. It's a little pop-out box that you should find at the bottom of your screen. The like button helps float the most popular questions to the top. So please use that feature if you see a similar question or something you want answered. Once again, we are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. With that, with people from around the world, it looks like, which is amazing, I'm going to hand things over to Michael. We've recorded his reflections earlier in the year, but Dr. Sugrue will be joining us at the end to take questions live. Sit back, enjoy the conversation about Robinson Crusoe, and we'll be back shortly for some more Q&A.
Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe, is often read by young people, by children, as an adventure story, and it is that. I know I read it that way when I was a child, but once when I was reading Marx, I noted that he said something kind of caustic about Robinson Crusoe and Defoe's novel, and it struck me as a funny thing for a political philosopher to want to look at or to be reading and commenting on. So I went and reread it as an adult, and it turns out to be a very different novel once you know about the intellectual history of the late 18th or the late 17th and early 18th centuries. It's arguable that the first really important novel in English is Robinson Crusoe, and published in 1719. And it is an allegory. It is a symbolic representation of the entirety of human history in microcosm. In other words, one man, Robinson Crusoe, thrown back into nature with only himself to rely upon, has to rebuild human life. And in so doing, he sequentially goes through the various phases of human history. So this is the Enlightenment view of the history of the world, writ small. And the things that he does all have symbolic, allegorical reference. Now, he goes to sea, but he says that his father told him not to, that his desire to rove and become wealthy and take risks was foolish, and he would be better off staying home and staying with what is familiar and having an easy, middling sort of life. Not too wealthy, but not too poor, not having extremes of anything. But young Robinson Crusoe will not listen. He disobeys his father. And the religious allegory is obvious. He is a prodigal son, and he is going to be punished for his refusal to obey the moral injunctions and suggestions that his father makes. He's enslaved, but gets away. And when he gets away from North African slavery, he takes with him in a small boat a boy named Xury, Xury. And then they're picked up by a Portuguese ship, and they're taken where the ship is going, which is Brazil. And he has no second thoughts about selling Xury to the captain. In other words, he reserves freedom for himself and takes his fellow runaway as a way to make some money. So he's an extremely, how can I put it, unsympathetic in several senses character. And that is in some ways what you might expect of an Enlightenment novel. In other words, there's an emphasis on things like calculation, numbering things, writing things down, keeping a diary, keeping an inventory, Robinson Crusoe is extremely interested in quantifying the world. It is not an emotional novel. It is more a novel of ideas, and most of what happens has its own symbolic reference. Now, you have to remember that the most important new political ideas in England in 1719 would have been Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which talks about natural rights and the state of nature and the obligations that people naturally owe one another, and starts with the atomized, isolated individual in a way that ancient political theory, like that of, say, Aristotle, which starts with the polis and the family, does not. Modern political theory breaks the minimal unit of political analysis down. In the ancient world, the family was the minimal unit. In modernity, starting in the Enlightenment, the individual atom of that broken up family is the minimal unit of analysis. So Robinson Crusoe is a kind of atomized individual, and he is completely isolated, and he goes through all the phases of human history. For example, when he gets washed up, he has to attend first to things like food and shelter. Then he works on clothing. Then he works on finding secure sources of food rather than just hunting and gathering. He moves into agriculture and then eventually domesticates animals. He invents pottery. He develops all the technologies characteristic of primitive peoples, and he takes them as far as he can. He is assisted in this process by two things. One is his religious faith. He is deeply Calvinistic. He believes that he has been sent to this island and washed ashore alone because of his impiety and his disobedience towards his father. He also is assisted by his lucky access to the ship. The ship that he was on grounds itself on a nearby reef. He makes a raft and goes out to the ship, strips off everything he can use. In particular, things like tools, fish hooks, iron, medicines, all kinds of things that it's going to be hard for him to create for himself. Symbolically, the ship is the Western intellectual tradition, going back to the Greeks and Romans. In other words, he's going to call upon the inherited knowledge of the West. He's going to combine that with a religious faith that's internal to him, that sustains him when things get extremely hard. There are 2 points when it's very clear that his faith is being tested. He's something like Job. The first is when he gets some sort of fever, and since he doesn't have much in the way, or since his medicine is very limited, in order to try and break the fever, he puts whole tobacco leaves into a vessel and then puts some sort of alcohol, I think it's rum, into the vessel and allows it to chemically interact, and then drinks the result. It is a testimony to the fact that actually tobacco was originally thought of and classified as being a drug, not being a harmless or irrelevant peculiarity. It started out as something that was part of the pharmacopoeia of the 18th century. Of course, people used it for pleasure, but this was as close as he could actually come to medicine. He also had a large collection of alcoholic beverages, such as the ship could afford him. And one of the very interesting things is that he was very temperate and even-headed in his use of alcohol. Apart from certain medicinal drams, he doesn't seem to have touched the stuff. There's a certain sort of asceticism, Christian asceticism, to be found there. At one point, he decided to try and create a giant canoe, and he would carve it out from the biggest tree on the island, and then he would hope to make his escape. Now, he spent some 5 years cutting this tree down and cutting out the groove, which would be the actual boat itself, which would give him some place to put himself and his food. And after 5 years, it dawned on him that he was not able, by any sort of lever or any sort of mechanical advantage, to move this immense felled tree. He put 5 years of work into this project and then realized that it was a complete dead end. What that represents in the allegory is the monument building age of the ancients, something like the Egyptian pyramids. It eats up a tremendous amount of labor and it doesn't really do anything. So at that point, he has a very deep sense of his own limitations. And myself, in that circumstance, I might be tempted to open a bottle. It might be a time for a drink, but not for Robinson Crusoe, who's a kind of avatar of self-restraint. He hardly even gets lonesome, it seems. He certainly gives no evidence of a sex drive. And he has a parrot that he teaches to talk. And he doesn't seem to be darkened by the absence of other people. In fact, it turns out quite the opposite. After 15 years or so, he sees on the beach a footprint that he knows is not his own. He realizes that there are other people who have come to his island, and they may mean him harm. So he's gone from a Lockean kind of political economy to a Hobbesian world. And he loads all his guns, and then he goes out carefully, stealthily, and looks for them, and sees that they have a captive that they intend to kill and eat because they're cannibals. Well, Robinson Crusoe weighs the options. He really has no right to kill other people. On the other hand, these cannibals are about to murder somebody they don't have the right to kill. And it's hard to know what to do. But when in doubt, Crusoe kills all the cannibalistic savages and frees the one who was about to be sacrificed. This one who is about to be sacrificed immediately gestures in such a way as to indicate that he wants to become, or he believes he has become, Crusoe's slave or servant. He bows down on the ground and he puts Crusoe's foot on his neck. The idea is that, and this comes from actually Lockean political theory, that slavery is an alternative to death in warfare. And that's one possible source of slavery as a legitimate institution. Crusoe doesn't know quite what to make of it, but eventually takes him on as a sort of butler. And he teaches his new servant, Friday, teaches him a bit of English. And he manages to show him the various civilizations or civilizing achievements that he's created. And so he brings Friday along up the ladder of civilization with him. At a later point, a ship has been taken over by mutinous sailors. They have landed on the island, which they believe is deserted. And Friday and Crusoe overcome the mutineers and reinstate the captain. So this allows Friday and Crusoe to get off the island, and it allows Crusoe to go back to Brazil, where he finds out that he's become fabulously rich because of the property and money that he had started with when he landed there, having sold Zuri. They eventually go to London. One of the things worth noting is that when some of the pirates ask for clemency and he allows them to stay on the island rather than go back to civilization and be hanged, there are both Protestants and Catholics, and he decides that he wants to, since he's the king of the island, that he extends religious toleration to both the Catholic Spaniard and to the other Protestant mutineers, which is actually a restatement of Locke's letter concerning toleration, except that he's willing even to extend it to the Spaniard under these circumstances, which Locke may have been uncertain about. The idea is that Lockean liberalism is built into Robinson Crusoe. The labor theory of value, since Crusoe has no money, he keeps a ledger, but he keeps a ledger in terms of the amount of time he spends doing things, and that's the value of the thing. It also, like many new attempts at any given genre, doesn't quite know how to finish itself. So Crusoe goes back to London, and he is wealthy. He meets some distant relatives to whom he gives some money. He doesn't seem to have any problem with the fact that he's completely isolated and alone. And it is a thoroughly emotionless conclusion. Friday dies of sudden illness, and then Crusoe says, well, Friday's dead, let's go get lunch. In other words, there's no mourning, there's no sadness, there's no tears. When Charles Dickens read this novel, he was aghast at the death of Friday. He said, he's been your only friend and your faithful servant for 25 years. And he dies, and everybody goes to get lunch. Dickens said, if I had written the death of Friday, it would have taken 20 pages and there wouldn't be a dry eye in the house. Poor faithful Friday, dying in England as a quasi-civilized man who's seen so much and been such a good friend. How will Crusoe get by without his closest friend? Nothing like that. No tears, no wailing, no mourning, no sadness. Just a quick end to the novel. So Defoe didn't know how to end his novel. Remember, we're very early in the history of the novel, and the hardest thing to work out in any literary genre is how do you finish the damn thing? Look back at the Homeric epics. The problem is, how do we finish this thing? Right, and it's not the only one of that kind. When a genre gets invented, the conclusion is often the last thing that gets tacked on, and it requires experimentation to figure out how to finish it. This is a great novel because it shows us how the West viewed itself. And it may be an accidentally great thing, like some other accidentally great literary or artistic achievements, but it really is channeling a certain Enlightenment self-understanding. And it represents the age of reason in literary form, which is by no means an easy thing to do, because the age of reason broke with the tradition of epic poetry. What supplanted the tradition of epic poetry was a new form called the novel. And the characteristic literary form of the Enlightenment is the novel. And this novel is self-referential in that it explains back what the Enlightenment thinks it's doing and who Enlightenment man thinks he is.
All right, thank you so much, Michael, for that lecture. If you could now join us by turning on your camera, that would be great. Thank you to those who wrote some questions in the question box. I see at least one right now. Please, during the Q&A section, feel free to continue adding questions to the discussion. Before we get to the first one, actually, I think the first one might have come in from a gentleman who also emailed me because he was very interested in having this question answered. And it's something, as I reread the novel this past couple of weeks, I had your lecture in mind, but this was the first question I had seen, and it came into play, and that was if it would be possible, could you speak some more about the animals in Robinson Crusoe? They're very highlighted throughout the entire novel as to what Crusoe uses to survive, as well as domesticate and everything like that. Could you speak a little bit more to the animals?
Yes. Okay. This is the story of the domination of nature by human beings. So he starts out on a level with any of the animals on the island, but he has two advantages. The first is internal. He has religious belief, which carries him along when he would otherwise despair. All right, happens more than once. So there's a latent Puritanism or a latent kind of evangelical Protestantism
Mhm.
in Crusoe and his story. Right? It's a retelling of Job. In addition to that, though, he has the ship, and the ship represents the Western tradition. So he can go and raid it and take all the stuff off it that he can, which takes the form of mostly tools. And the reason why is that what the Western tradition supplies him with is intellectual tools. And he then spends an awful lot of his time measuring things, engaging things, and adding things up and quantifying the disorderly universe around him. Now, this is going to include animals. I don't think he meets any dangerous animals on the island, except people. He has a parrot that he teaches to talk. And I've often wondered if it isn't a wry comment on human beings, actually, that he doesn't lose anything in conversation. In other words, he never shows signs of loneliness. And my guess is that for a strange creature like Crusoe, listening to the parrot talk is not significantly different from listening to a person, a very mechanical sort of universe and a very mechanical sort of view of human nature. Same sort of thing with the goats that get domesticated. Those are not just goats. Those are providential goats, like his providential rice. And then he takes advantage of it using the tools of rationality.
Okay. One of the questions that I had for you is, as I was researching this, I came across a number of articles, specifically one from The Guardian, but there was also one from the Smithsonian a couple of years back, because of course the novel just celebrated its 300th anniversary in 2019. So there's been a lot of articles in the past few years about Robinson Crusoe. One Marie shared in the chat panel, which was the real story of the gentleman who supposedly Robinson Crusoe is based off of, Selkirk. Yeah. And it was a really interesting article, well written by the Smithsonian. But there was another article by The Guardian, which I believe is a British magazine, speaking to whether or not Crusoe should actually be taken off the shelves because of the more controversial thought process. And I was wondering if you could speak to that controversy over whether or not Defoe idolized like slave trader, the piracy, other assumptions made by the book, as well as, let me read this quote from The Guardian that I found very interesting. In 1719, Robinson Crusoe brought onto the page certain assumptions of its time, that slavery is okay and can be squared with Christianity, that the function of women in society is to serve men, that people whose skin color is not white are savages, and did not challenge them. Now, do you believe that we can challenge them enough in this day and age and look at it more as a historical picture of where thoughts were, a snapshot in time, or rather an ideal that should be followed today?
Well, the author is right that Crusoe and Defoe don't have any problem with the slave trade. And Crusoe's a heartless bastard. I mean, he sells off Zuri when they both made their escape together, and that's the foundation of his fortune. I mean, he is not a likable character. There's a bit of the homo economicus there that doesn't make close connections. On the other hand, stop and think. Well, yes, this is not disapproving of slavery. If your standard for what we're allowed to read and think about and talk about is whether it disapproves of slavery or not, there's nothing we're allowed to talk or think about that isn't about less than 100 or 250 years old.
Yeah.
And what that means is that all previous literature has to go. And so there's a point at which the adults in the room have to step up and say, look, every kind of literature, including the critics that are current now, is a product of its time. And the fact of the matter is that if you want to know about the human condition and you want to know about human history, then you have to enter into the minds of people who thought differently from you. That's not the problem. That's the idea. If anybody comes away from reading Crusoe saying, boy, I really wish they'd bring slavery back, I might take the qualms seriously. But I don't think anybody's ever done that. Right. So I think it's a false alarm. in a little bit like I'm certainly concerned with the problem of teenage suicide and self-harm and that kind of thing, but I don't want them to butcher Hamlet's to be or not to be.
Mm-hmm.
You leave it in there, and teachers have to be sharp-eyed and know their students. It's not Shakespeare's fault, all right? But so that's the argument I would make. I'm a historian, and I don't like censorship.
No, I appreciate that, and neither do I. And that's why I was kind of surprised when I read this article, in that sense of like having to you have to read it from a critical thought process, in the sense that this was 1719, and unfortunately at that time it was very accepted. And actually that goes to another question, was how general in England was Defoe's way of thinking?
Okay. The religious aspect of it was very general. Everybody was immersed in a kind of Protestant Christianity, biblical Christianity, that had more of an influence on their everyday life back then than it does now. All right. The significance of religion is to a great extent attenuated. So it's hard for us to project ourselves back there. So the religious dimension, for example, Crusoe a couple of times has bad things happen to him after his father admonishes him. And the father, of course, represents God the Father. Don't stray away from home. If you do, you're going to regret it. This is a retelling of the Prodigal Son story from the New Testament. And it's also a retelling of the story of Job, because he's going to get tested. Everyone reading it would have understood, that could read, would have understood that, because they all would have understood the Bible. Now, this other stuff that comes from Locke, like the labor theory of value, that may or may not have been understood by very many people. Right there, you have to actually be a reader, and and caught up with the culture of your time, and that's always a small slice of society.
Wonderful. And then was the novel immediately understood as allegorical when it was published?
Yeah.
And who read it at that time? Like, what was kind of the general audience at the time when it was published? I know it later became very, like, you have the full novel, but you also have abbreviated versions of the novel for children's books.
Right.
But at the time, and when it was originally published, who read it, and was it understood as an allegory?
Novels were viewed as being trash. They were not taken seriously as literature, right? In the same way that plays at Shakespeare's time were viewed as trash. So it was middle-class people that had managed to become literate. And so that meant they were usually urban, and they were often associated with very radical Protestant sects like the Puritans. So there was a high degree of literacy in the nonconformist sects of English Protestantism. And so if you go to Manchester, or you go to any of the great what will become industrial towns, what you'll find is commercial capitalists who have bought into this, and they educate their children, including their daughters, which is a big deal. And what that means is now there's a market for novels. Right? You need mass popular literacy.
Okay. That's really interesting, because I didn't even think about the fact that, a lot of women, especially going into the later 18th century and 19th century, were like the huge readers of novels, right. More so sometimes than men were in that sense. So that's an interesting thought process. We've talked about it. We've touched a little bit on the general tone of the area, but could you speak to Defoe's background a little bit? I mean, he was a journalist, a pamphleteer, a novelist. Could you give us a little bit of background on?
It was what the Brits called a scribbler. Right? Have pen, will, for hire. So he no doubt was a prolific ghostwriter, but he also was a journalist. His Journal of the Plague Year was a rather grim review of human nature and how little compassion survives. The threat of death and the kind of this kind of spitefulness that enters into people. So that's actually a kind of worrisome book.
just in the sense that it's a very bitter book about human nature. Moll Flanders, on the other hand, his novel is about not the prodigal son, but the prodigal daughter, right? And she comes around too, but she's a dubiously likable heroine. And since, as far as I can tell, there's no, I could be wrong, but I don't see an allegory there. I think that's a big part of why it was less popular. Here, children read it with Robinson Crusoe, and then if they look at it as an adult, it turns out to be a completely different book. And one of the things that I like about being a lifetime reader is that experience of, I thought I knew this book, but on the other hand, 20 years is a long time. You look at it, you ask different questions. Certainly the Bible and the great religious texts of the world are like that. If you come to them at 20 and you come to them at 60, they're different books.
It's true. It's true. And actually, that brings a nice segue, is that you've talked about the religious ideals, like Crusoe's hold on to his religious thing. Going into your relationship of this is essentially the history of the world and everything, the religious ideals in the history of the world, is this kind of a statement from Defoe, do you think, regarding religious belief and survival and the relationship of the two?
Sure. Yeah, Rousseau thinks that, or not Rousseau, Crusoe is an example of the idea that religious belief is pre-rational. In other words, that's something we start out with innately. He would have seen atheism, kind of a scientific reductive materialism, as both wildly implausible and enormously impious. Right. In other words, so for him, that would be not just impious, but obviously irrational. If God didn't exist, the world would have no rational order, and he wouldn't be able to kick nature's butt as effectively as he does, bringing out all these things like sextants and levels and measuring tapes from the tools that he gets on the ship. So the ship is Athens. The ship is the tradition of Greek rationality. But prior to that, he's already formatted to view these things in a Christian template. So there's a meaning to all adversity, just like there is in the history of the chosen people. If you do bad stuff, God will warn you, as he does when his father says, don't do this bad stuff. You shouldn't be so interested in getting rich. You should actually be more interested in getting good. But he ignores his father's warning. And of course, the result is the parable of the prodigal son.
Going into the scientific side of things, did the scientific revolution play a part at all in the novel? For example, Galileo, etc., especially, with all of the scientific tools and everything that he was using?
Well, it does, in the sense that the reason why they're exploring unknown territory, and that is, to the best of his knowledge, uninhabited territory, is because the scientific revolution is what's going to enable the age of European colonization and exploration. In other words, it's very important, if you're going to discover a new world, to figure out how to get back there when you take all their stuff, right? Because you want to go back there and take more of their stuff. You don't want any kind of haphazard stuff there. So for that, you need cartography, you need navigation, you need astronomy, and all of those are extrapolations from the transformation of astronomy and then the other natural sciences, starting with Galileo and Kepler even.
Okay. This is changing subject slightly. This came in from one of our listeners, and I find it's not a silly question at all. They're like, so I'm sorry if this is silly, but why is the character's name Friday? Do you have any idea?
Because it's a Friday when he gets saved from being eaten. So he couldn't think of any other name for him, so they called him Friday. Right.
Yeah.
Remember, he's not poetic, right? I mean, what do I call him? I could call him Tree. There's no sense of human warfare. I could call you number one or number two or number three. In other words, there's nothing personal about their relationship. So he calls him Friday. right? You could call him Shovel. That's what's strange about this novel. The novel, when it's transformed by the Romantics, starting at the late part of the 18th century, is going to become a vehicle for the creation of very powerful emotional stress and also the release of that stress. A good example would be something like Werther.
Yeah.
But also later on, if you think of Julian Sorel in The Red and the Black, which is really an amazing novel, or even Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, there are so many, or even another fine romantic, a beautiful romantic, Jane Austen.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Mr. Darcy is full of passion and full of fire, and so is Elizabeth Barrett. Elizabeth Barrett, if she'd been shipwrecked for 15 years and met another human being that wanted to be her servant, would not have named it Friday. She would have named it Anne. She would have named the person Anne or something. In other words, or Bob. There would have been a real human connection there, because that's what romantic novels thrive on. Here we have a very weird splicing together of kind of stoical enlightenment rationality and the events which somebody like Dickens said, look, I would have taken this to the bank, baby. You wait and you see Friday die under my pen. And that's such a great point that he made. In other words, what we haven't got in the novel yet is human emotion.
Yeah. When I reread it, I had read it as well as 12 or 13 years old. It was one of my dad's favorite books. They were struggling to get me to read anything but mystery and Hardy Boys and everything like that. So they started giving me adventure novels. And I really liked it as a kid, but listening to your lecture, and when I knew this was coming up, I reread it as well. And I realized that for some reason, as a kid, you read it as adventure and it's that exciting. But as an adult, there is very little emotion to connect to Crusoe himself. Like, he's not a sympathetic character whatsoever.
No, he wasn't. He turns on Zuri. What kind of heartless SOB would do that?
Well, and you're also, it's one of those things of reading it as an adult in the sense of like reading, with the lens of today. One of the questions that came in, and we touched a little bit about this, was, how does this classic fit with the fairly recent critical lens of diversity and anti-racism? And it's hard to read it nowadays without looking at it some ways, with that lens. Do you have any advice or thoughts towards that?
Well, my point is, there are lots of books I read that don't reflect my idea of the good life. All right. I feel real bad for Oedipus. I don't think any of my students come away with the idea that I'm endorsing parricide and incest. All right. If they did, I would be very worried. But because these are understandably touchy topics, because, well, some people really do kill their father, and some people really do have incestuous families with their mother. But my sense is that regrettable as those cases may be, I'd still like to be able to teach Oedipus, because I think it has more to say to us than that, right?
Yeah.
I think that the problem here is not the texts themselves so much as it is the level of teacher engagement. If you know your students, you see the ones that are troubled. I mean, they're like struggling fish in the water. You can see them. And that's the way to, I think, deal with potentially upsetting topics. Remember that anything can be upsetting given the peculiarities of people's lives. So what I would think is that we ought to be able to understand, which means both criticize and appreciate the mindsets of people that were prior to us. Right? We should be very careful about assuming that we're the most moral people in the history of the universe. I mean, we might be, but on the other hand, you never know what's going to come up. Remember that forever is a long time. So what I would be inclined to say is don't lose a moral perspective on literature. I think that's essential. But don't make literature the beast of burden for political commitments that may or may not be helpful in understanding the book.
Thank you for that. That's an interesting look at it in a way that I hadn't heard it phrased that way. So that's a nice way to look at it. I have another question here. When we were talking lack of emotion, this one popped up, and is, with the lack of emotion in the novel, how did it survive the popularity through the 19th century, especially with the more romantic?
This is when it
books?
becomes. This is when it becomes a children's book. The surface story is not complicated, and it's sort of interesting, right? And then, of course, there are moments of great suspense when he sees the footprint and has to acknowledge the other. The book is a strange sort of Cartesian thing. There's the nature, which is the island, and there's one mind on the whole thing, Crusoe's. I don't think we expect children, 12 and 13-year-olds, to understand that, but what they will understand is things like self-reliance and the importance of work and being a self-starter and responsibility. In Rousseau, he wrote a novel of education called The Emile, and the only book that Emile is allowed to read growing up is Robinson Crusoe, because he wants him to learn that idea of being a self-sufficient unit, even though he's not going to go to an uninhabited island. So clearly, Rousseau sees the allegory, but says, even though the children won't, it has beneficial effects on them. Get to work.
Okay. I didn't realize that it was changed into a children's story that quickly, but that would completely make sense, especially in that time frame and the abridged. I have another towards the children's side of things. Children's versions are sanitized, quote unquote. Do you think that future children's versions will attempt to highlight the evils of slavery and other topics that
they might? In other words, I don't know that the children who are reading this for the first time, let's call them 12, I don't know that there's a big constituency for pro-slavery thought among them. So it seems to me, in a way, perhaps overkill to introduce anti-slavery stuff. I don't think it follows from that people are going to draw the pro-slavery inference. The fact that, I mean, I've heard of a very interesting children's version that doesn't have any text at all. That's just pictures.
Interesting.
Which is a kind of an interesting idea. And, you can take Crusoe in a lot of different ways, and they're not mutually exclusive. All right. So you might talk about slavery and how it's not only accepted here, but even without moral qualms. This is a guy that's obsessed about his own guiltiness, has no second thoughts about selling Zurich. So the extent of his moral imagination is truncated. That's certainly something worth talking about. On the other hand, to expect that he is, William Lloyd Garrison in 1719 in England, is just ahistorical. It's not a reasonable thing to expect. I mean, in the same way, and for pretty much the same reason that anybody in any prior century prior to Crusoe, the chances of them thinking slavery or serfdom are bad are very small.
It's an interesting take, when you were talking about the visualizations and like there's a book out there that's just the pictures, because part of that Guardian article that I was reading suggested that part of the reason the book was written was Defoe had a number of purchases and was basically creating a pamphlet for islands and for whatever, that it read that descriptively in the scenery. And there's a couple movies out there of Robinson Crusoe that on YouTube, I think Marie shared one of the links of the English version that I found. It was the 1954 film that's now on YouTube. And there's 3 or 4 out there, and they couldn't tell me which language they were in. So I was clicking through them to make sure that they were English. And I swear I probably had to click through half the film before you heard dialogue, because it's just mostly imagery and watching Crusoe do the survival. So it is very much, the emotion might not be there, but the imagery for sure in the book is definitely there. Final question that came in so far. This is a warning to our listeners. We have about a couple more minutes to answer any other questions you may have. But when Crusoe goes back home, how does Defoe see a parallel to the return of the prodigal son? So going back to some of that religious text.
He brings back a chastened self. He's been taught a lesson through the providence of God that saved him when he didn't actually have it coming. God, his father warned him, he was shipwrecked, and he actually got home. And then his father warned him again, look, God's sending you a message. And he went out again anyway. So he has to be chastened like Job in this 25-year prison sentence on the island. But then, like Job, he's given back all this great stuff, all this money and everything. And like the prodigal son, he goes back to what he regards as his home, which is England. He takes Friday with him, but he really isn't able to integrate himself back into society. So I'm sure that his heavenly father is as happy as the father in the prodigal son was, but I'm not certain that that his father in this world is, because I think he's dead by the time he gets back.
Okay. Now I'm going to test your knowledge here as one final question, because I can't come up with any at the time. But with Crusoe being basically one of the first, hugely popular English novels, but really kind of the first of its kind in English, right? What were some? I know that there were 2 follow-ups to Crusoe that Defoe wrote, and then Defoe also had a number of other books. Was there another author of about the same time that also had started writing novels, or was there kind of a bridge between Defoe's time and the next novelists in English or European literature?
It became a genre or a demi-genre. They used to call it what, Crusoe something, Crusoe Stück or something. And the idea would be whatever European language it was being written in, it would involve either one guy, returning to the island or going to another island or having a different set of experiences because somebody's trying to illuminate a different view of human nature. There's also things like the Swiss Family Robinson, where you can get all, that's an Aristotelian book. In other words, the minimal unit of society in the Swiss Family Robinson is not the individual, it's not Lockean, it's a whole family. It's actually Aristotelian, which was for about 2,000 years, the minimal unit of society, because you need to be able to reproduce. So for the ancient and medieval political theorists, the minimal unit is not the atom of the individual, it's the molecule of the family. Okay, well, that's what the Swiss Family Robinson is. It's an Aristotelian retort to the individualism of Crusoe. I'm sure that there's a whole collection of other books, but I mean, I just don't know them. I just know Crusoe. Yeah. It helps us with that, but I've heard that it's a minor genre. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michael. I really do appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
We always enjoy them. So it has been a fun one, speaking about the dangers and importance of Crusoe and just like that children's novel, but with different eyes the older you get as you read it, which is always fun. We do have another webinar coming up tomorrow titled Facilitating Media Literacy with Civic Purpose. We will explore the close ties between media literacy and civic participation. We will be joined by the Education Development Center again to discuss the library's role as a democratizing institution in polarized culture. But since I have Michael still with me, if you are enjoying the Classics Revisited series, we are continuing the series this year with our next webinar being on May 4th. That will be John Stuart Mills's Utilitarianism, which is a very interesting lecture, and I'm excited to speak with him about that one. Please keep an eye on our website for dates and times of our other upcoming webinars. All of our Classics Revisited series with the professor are available on YouTube, so you can certainly help promote them as circulation. If you do have people asking you at your libraries, they can go onto YouTube. It is open to the public. This allows you to share the webinars with the staff as well as your patrons. And if the dates and times do not work for you for any of our webinars, they are always recorded and on-demand viewing. Just visit bibliotheca.com for more information. Also be sure to subscribe at the bottom of the Bibliotheca pages to receive any future information about upcoming webinars. Finally, as we finish off today, we would love for everybody to complete a quick survey to see how you enjoyed our work break with the classics. I actually highly encourage you. Michael and I were just talking about the final lectures that we still have yet to record for this year. So if you have any books that you really, really want to hear about or genres that you want to hear about, go ahead and make those suggestions in that survey. We are looking at those as we plan out the rest of the webinar series for the 2021 year. But with that, from everyone at Bibliotheca, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Michael, once again for leading today's discussion. We really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.